I was 25 years old when my father sold me for £100, and I was 25 years old when a stranger bought me for £1 million. Both transactions occurred within the span of 3 minutes, beneath the glittering chandeliers of Ashworth Manor, while 500 members of London society watched in breathless silence. The evening had begun as all such evenings did, with the rustle of silk and the murmur of polite conversation, with champagne flutes catching candlelight and orchestras playing waltzes that I would never be asked to dance. I stood near the tall windows overlooking the garden, my gloved hands folded before me, my face arranged in the pleasant expression I had perfected over years of being overlooked. My gown was 3 seasons old. Carefully mended by my own hands, the pale blue silk faded just enough that discerning eyes could tell. And in those ballrooms, every eye was discerning. The scent of hothouse roses hung heavy in the air, mingling with French perfume and candle wax, and the subtle undertone of expensive wine. Crystal teardrops dripped from the chandeliers overhead, casting rainbow prisms across the marble floor whenever someone passed too close. The orchestra played a Strauss waltz, the notes floating through the vast ballroom like bright ribbons unfurling in a summer breeze. Ladies in gowns of every conceivable color swirled past with their partners, their laughter ringing out like silver bells, their happiness a mirror in which I saw only my own reflection, alone, overlooked, and growing older by the minute. My father, Baron Cornelius Whitmore, stood across the room with a glass of port in his hand and desperation in his eyes. I had learned to read that desperation over the years, to trace its evolution from mild concern to quiet panic, to the reckless abandon that now animated his features. His debts had mounted like winter snow, silent and relentless, until they threatened to bury us entirely. The creditors had grown impatient. The estate in Hampshire was mortgaged beyond recovery, and I, his only remaining asset, had failed spectacularly to secure the wealthy husband who might have saved us all. I watched him drain his glass and signal for another, noting the slight tremor in his hand, the flush that crept up his neck despite the chill of the evening. He had been drinking more heavily these past months, seeking courage at the bottom of bottles, finding only the shadow of it there. Once he had been a proud man, stern but fair, devoted to my mother and protective of our family's honor. Now he was a hollow shell of that man, eaten away from the inside by shame and fear and the relentless pressure of debts that would never be repaid. It was not for lack of trying on my part, though society would never believe that. At 18, I had been considered passably pretty, with my mother's dark hair and my father's gray eyes, with a figure that was slender without being fashionably fragile. My complexion was clear, my teeth were straight, my education was impeccable. I could play the pianoforte with some skill, speak French with reasonable fluency, and embroider with the delicate precision that young ladies of quality were expected to possess. I had received 3 proposals that first season, and I had accepted the most promising of them, a young viscount named Geoffrey Alcott, who spoke of poetry and promised me a life of gentle companionship. He had kind eyes and a gentle manner, and when he kissed my hand in the moonlight of my father's garden, I had thought myself the luckiest woman in England. We were to be married in June, when the roses bloomed and the world seemed full of possibility. In April, he eloped with my closest friend. The news had arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, delivered by a letter in Cecily's handwriting, the words blurring together as tears filled my eyes. She was sorry, she wrote, so terribly sorry, but she and Geoffrey had fallen deeply and irrevocably in love. They were bound for Scotland, for Gretna Green, where couples could marry without the consent of their families. She hoped I would understand, would forgive them both in time, would find someone who loved me as completely as Geoffrey loved her. I had burned the letter in the fireplace and wept until there were no more tears left. And then I had dressed carefully in my best morning gown, applied powder to hide the evidence of my grief, and walked downstairs to face my father with the news that would begin our family's slow descent into ruin. The scandal had been immense, not because of any wrongdoing on my part, but because society requires a villain and a victim, and it is so much more satisfying when the victim is also somehow to blame. What had I done to drive him away? The whispers asked. What coldness in my character, what deficiency in my person had sent him fleeing into the arms of another? Was I too clever, too plain, too proud? Was there some secret flaw, some hidden failing that only Geoffrey had been able to perceive? The questions were never answered because they were never meant to be answered. They were meant to linger, to stain, to mark me as damaged goods in a marketplace where reputation was everything. I became a cautionary tale, a warning to other young women about the dangers of trusting too easily, of loving without reserve, of believing that happiness could last. 7 years had passed since then, 7 years of diminishing prospects and mounting debts, of watching my father's hair turn gray and his hands begin to tremble, of selling the silver and then the paintings and then my mother's jewelry piece by precious piece. Each auction felt like a small death, another fragment of my mother's memory slipping away into the hands of strangers who would never know how she had treasured these things, never understand the stories they contained. My mother herself had died when I was 12, carried away by a fever that struck without warning and left without mercy. I remembered her still with perfect clarity, her warm brown eyes, her gentle laugh, the way she smelled of lavender and old books. She had taught me to read before I could walk, had filled my head with stories of brave heroines and honorable gentlemen, had promised me that true love was real and that I would find it someday. Sometimes I wondered if she was the fortunate one, spared the slow dissolution of everything she had loved. But such thoughts were unworthy, and I pushed them aside as I watched my father make his way toward the center of the ballroom. There was something different in his bearing tonight, something that made my stomach clench with foreboding. He moved with the terrible courage of a man who has nothing left to lose. The orchestra fell silent. Conversations died away like embers in a dying fire. 500 faces turned toward my father as he raised his glass and cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the suddenly still ballroom like a gunshot. I knew, in that moment, that something catastrophic was about to happen. I could feel it in the sudden stillness of the air, in the way the candle flames seemed to hold their breath, in the prickling sensation that raced across my skin like the warning before a lightning strike. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to gather my skirts and run into the night and never look back. But my feet remained rooted to the floor, my body frozen in the particular paralysis of someone watching disaster approach in slow, inexorable motion. My father's voice rang out across the ballroom, surprisingly strong for a man who had seemed so defeated mere moments before. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I must beg your indulgence for an unconventional announcement. I am a man of limited means and unlimited debts, and I have a daughter of excellent character who remains, through no fault of her own, unmarried." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a wave of whispered speculation that seemed to roll from one end of the ballroom to the other. I felt the heat of embarrassment begin its slow crawl up my neck, spreading across my cheeks like a fever. The powder I had so carefully applied suddenly felt like a mask, fragile and insufficient, unable to hide the shame that surely blazed from my features like a beacon. My father continued, his voice taking on an edge of desperate bravado that made me cringe. "Therefore, I hereby offer the sum of £100 to any gentleman of respectable standing who will take her as his wife. She is educated, accomplished, and possessed of a gentle temperament. She will make an admirable companion to any man wise enough to see her value." The silence that followed was absolute. It pressed against my ears like deep water, drowning out everything except the frantic beating of my own heart. I could not move. I could not breathe. I could only stand there, pinned beneath the weight of 500 stares, each one a small needle of judgment and pity and barely concealed amusement. This was what I had become. Not a woman, not a person, but a commodity to be hawked like livestock at a country fair. 100 pounds. That was my worth in my father's eyes, in society's eyes, in the eyes of every man who now looked upon me with speculation or disgust or cold indifference. A sum that might buy a decent horse, a modest carriage, a year's wages for a servant. That was the price my father placed upon my head, upon my heart, upon my entire future. Someone laughed. It was a small sound, quickly stifled behind a gloved hand. But it broke the spell of silence, and suddenly the room erupted in whispers. I caught fragments of conversation as they swirled around me like autumn leaves in a bitter wind. Poor creature, I heard. How humiliating. Did you see her face? Going quite red? She must wish the floor would open and swallow her whole. 100 pounds, as if she were a horse. The Whitmore girl, yes. The one with the scandal, the jilted bride. No wonder no one will have her after all these years. I thought of running. I thought of dying. I thought of sinking through the polished marble floor and disappearing into the earth below, where no one could see me, where no one could judge me, where I could finally be at peace. The weight of their stares pressed down upon me like a physical force, and I swayed slightly, catching myself against the windowsill behind me, the cold glass pressing through my gloves like a reminder that I was still alive, still present, still enduring this nightmare with every fiber of my being. And then a voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. I will pay 1 million pounds. The whispers stopped. The laughter stopped. Even the candles seemed to stop their flickering, freezing in place as every eye in the room turned toward the speaker. The words hung in the air like something physical, something that had weight and substance, and for a moment I was not certain that I had heard correctly. 1 million pounds. The sum was so vast, so impossibly immense, that my mind struggled to comprehend it. He stood near the grand staircase, a tall figure in impeccable evening dress, his dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from marble. I had seen him before, of course, at various society functions over the years, but always from a distance, always as a figure of myth rather than reality. Thaddeus Ravencourt, the Duke of Ashford, was not the sort of man one approached casually. He was not the sort of man one approached at all. The Ravencourts were old money, old titles, old power. Their lineage could be traced back to the Norman conquest, their bloodline entangled with kings and queens throughout the centuries. Their estate at Thornwood Hall was legendary, a vast Gothic mansion set amid hundreds of acres of parkland in the wild countryside of Northumberland, where the moors stretched endlessly beneath grey skies and the wind carried the scent of heather and rain. The current Duke had inherited at 23, following the tragic death of his parents in a carriage accident, and had since earned a reputation for cold brilliance and colder temperament. He rarely attended social functions. He never danced. He spoke only when necessary and smiled not at all. His presence at the Ashworth ball had already been the subject of endless speculation, for he had not been seen in London society for nearly 2 years. Some whispered that grief had driven him mad, that he wandered the halls of Thornwood like a ghost, that the ancient house was cursed, and anyone who entered never truly left. 3 years ago, he had married Lady Arabella Kingsley, a celebrated beauty who was said to have captured his heart completely. She had been everything society admired, graceful and accomplished, charming and delicate, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes like summer sky. Their wedding had been the event of the season, covered in every newspaper, discussed in every drawing room, held up as the perfect union of beauty and power. She had died of consumption 18 months later, and the Duke had retreated to Thornwood Hall like a wounded animal seeking darkness. His re-emergence into society tonight had been the subject of endless speculation, but no one had expected this. No one had expected him to stand in the middle of Ashworth Manor's ballroom and offer a fortune for a disgraced spinster. The silence stretched on, elastic and unbearable, pulled taut as a bowstring about to snap. My father's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish pulled from water. The Duke's expression remained impassive, his dark eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, as if he had not just upended the entire social order with 6 simple words. I studied him in that suspended moment, trying to understand what I was seeing. He stood with military precision, his broad shoulders perfectly straight, his gloved hands clasped behind his back. His features were aristocratic and severe, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, a nose that might have been called Roman, lips pressed into a thin line that suggested neither pleasure nor displeasure, but merely existence. He was handsome in the way that statues are handsome, perfectly formed but utterly cold, inspiring admiration rather than warmth. And yet there was something in his eyes, something I could not quite name. A flicker of emotion beneath the glacial surface, a crack in the marble facade. It was gone before I could identify it, shuttered behind walls that seemed impenetrable, but I had seen it. I was certain I had seen it. Finally, someone spoke. It was Lord Ashworth himself, the host of the evening's ball, a portly gentleman with magnificent whiskers and a perpetually bewildered expression. He stepped forward from the crowd, his hands raised in a gesture that might have been supplication or confusion. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," he stammered, his voice pitched high with disbelief. "Did you say £1,000,000? The Duke's gaze shifted to Lord Ashworth with the lazy precision of a predator acknowledging prey. There was no aggression in the look, merely assessment, the calm evaluation of a man who had measured the world and found it wanting. "I did," he said. His voice was deep and measured, utterly devoid of emotion, each word falling into the silence like a stone into still water. £1,000,000 to be settled upon Baron Whitmore immediately following the marriage ceremony. I trust that is acceptable. He was not asking. Despite the formal phrasing, there was no question in his tone, no uncertainty. He was stating facts, as if they had already been decided, as if the future were simply a script he was reading aloud for the benefit of those who had not yet seen it. My father found his voice at last, stepping forward with an eagerness that made me wince. "Your Grace," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush like water through a broken dam. "This is most generous, most unexpected. I hardly know what to say. My daughter, she is everything I claimed and more. You will not regret this decision. I can assure you that she will make you an excellent wife, an exemplary duchess. She has been raised with every accomplishment and virtue that a man of your stature might desire." I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab my father by the shoulders and shake him until his teeth rattled, until he remembered that I was his daughter and not merely a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. I wanted to demand how he could speak of me as if I were not standing right there, as if I had no voice, no will, no agency of my own. But the words stuck in my throat like stones, and I could only watch as the two men discussed my future as casually as they might discuss the weather or the price of grain. The Duke's eyes found mine for the first time. They were dark, nearly black in the candlelight, and utterly unreadable. I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, pressing against my skin, searching for something I could not name. It was not the look of a man evaluating merchandise, not quite. There was something else there, something that made my heart beat faster despite my fear. I wanted to look away. I could not look away. "The lady has not yet agreed," he said quietly. It was such a small thing, that acknowledgement, such a tiny gesture of respect in an evening that had stripped away every shred of my dignity. And yet it struck me with the force of a thunderbolt, this recognition that I was a person rather than a possession, that my consent was something to be sought rather than assumed. In all the discussion of pounds and arrangements and marriage settlements, he was the first to remember that I had a voice of my own. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my response. I could feel the eyes upon me, the judgment, the curiosity, the delicious anticipation of scandal. Whatever I said next would be dissected and analyzed and repeated in drawing rooms across London for weeks to come. I would be the subject of gossip columns and dinner party conversations, my choice examined and debated by people who had never spoken a word to me. I thought of my father's debts, mounting higher each day like a tide that could not be turned back. I thought of the creditors who would come knocking, who would strip away the last vestiges of our family's dignity. I thought of the workhouse that awaited those who could not pay, the grinding poverty that would swallow us whole if this offer were refused. And I thought of the man before me, this stranger who had offered a fortune for my hand without explanation or hesitation. There was something in his eyes that I could not identify, some flicker of emotion beneath the glacial surface. Pain, perhaps, or purpose, or something else entirely, something I would need time to understand. "I accept," I said. The words emerged stronger than I expected, steady and clear in the hushed ballroom. I saw surprise flicker across the faces of those nearest to me, as if they had expected me to refuse, to choose pride over practicality, dignity over survival. Perhaps they thought I would be offended by such an unorthodox proposal, insulted by being purchased like property, regardless of the sum involved. Perhaps they wanted me to refuse, to provide them with additional scandal to discuss over their morning chocolate. But I had learned long ago that pride was a luxury I could not afford, and dignity was a currency that held no value in the marketplace of matrimony. I had been humiliated already, stripped bare before the entire cream of London society. What was one more indignity in exchange for security, for freedom from debt, for a future that did not end in poverty and disgrace? The Duke inclined his head in a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or approval. His expression remained unchanged, that mask of cold indifference firmly in place, but I thought I saw something in his eyes soften slightly. Or perhaps that was merely wishful thinking, the desperate hope of a woman grasping at straws. "Very well," he said. "I will call upon you tomorrow to discuss the arrangements." He turned to my father. "Baron Whitmore, I trust you will have your daughter prepared for the wedding within a fortnight. I do not wish to delay." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward the door. The crowd parted before him like waves before a ship, every eye following his progress with undisguised fascination. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor, measured and unhurried, the walk of a man who had never in his life needed to rush for anything. At the threshold, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. The candlelight caught his features at a new angle, softening the severe lines, making him appear almost human for a fleeting moment. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the sound of my name in his voice was strange and foreign and unexpectedly intimate. "I look forward to making your acquaintance." And then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the entrance hall, leaving behind a ballroom full of whispers and speculation, and a woman who had just agreed to marry a stranger for reasons she could not begin to comprehend. The days that followed passed in a blur of activity and anxiety, a whirlwind of preparations that left me dizzy and exhausted. My father, drunk on the promise of financial salvation, threw himself into the wedding preparations with an enthusiasm that bordered on manic. He hired dressmakers and florists and caterers, spending money we did not yet have with the confidence of a man who had already counted his million. He spoke of paying off debts and restoring the estate, of returning to society with his head held high, of the grandchildren who would carry the Whitmore name into the next generation. I listened to his plans and said nothing. There seemed little point in speaking when no one was interested in hearing. The dressmakers arrived in waves, an army of seamstresses and milliners and experts in lace and silk and every conceivable trimming. They measured and pinned and tutted over my figure, debating the merits of various styles and fabrics as if I were a mannequin, to be dressed rather than a woman with opinions of my own. I submitted to their ministrations with weary resignation, allowing them to drape me in sample fabrics and argue about whether ivory or cream would better suit my complexion. The wedding gown they created was magnificent, I had to admit. ivory silk satin with a 12-foot train, the bodice embroidered with seed pearls and silver thread, the sleeves of delicate Alençon lace that had been imported from France at considerable expense. When I stood before the mirror in the final fitting, I looked like a princess from a fairy tale, beautiful and remote and utterly unlike myself. I did not feel like a bride. I felt like an actress preparing for a role, donning a costume that belonged to someone else. The Duke called upon me twice in that fortnight, as propriety demanded. The first visit was brief and businesslike, conducted in our modest drawing room with my father hovering anxiously in the background. His Grace reviewed the marriage contract with the detached efficiency of a solicitor, explained the provisions he had made for my comfort and security, and departed within the hour. He did not smile. He barely looked at me. The contract itself was generous beyond anything I had expected. I would have a substantial allowance of my own, managed by my own hand rather than through my husband. I would have access to his properties and carriages, his staff and resources. In the event of his death, I would be provided for handsomely, with a dower house and income that would sustain me in comfort for the rest of my life. He had thought of everything, anticipated every need, planned for every contingency, and yet the document felt cold in my hands, a business arrangement rather than a marriage. I signed where indicated and tried not to think about what I was surrendering. The second visit was stranger. He arrived on a gray afternoon when rain streaked the windows and the world outside seemed washed of color. My father had gone to meet with his creditors, flush with promises of imminent payment, and I received the Duke alone in the same drawing room where we had first discussed our arrangement. The propriety of this situation was questionable at best, but I found that I did not care. What was reputation to me now? I was already marked, already fallen in the eyes of society. One more small scandal would make no difference to my future. He stood by the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the dreary sky, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The rain drummed against the glass like impatient fingers, and somewhere in the house a clock ticked steadily, counting out the seconds of our silence. I studied his profile in the gray light, noting the sharp line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows, the way his hands clasped behind his back with military precision. He was handsome in the way that mountains are handsome, impressive and forbidding and utterly indifferent to admiration. "You are wondering why I did it," he said at last. His voice was quiet, almost contemplative, as if he were speaking to himself rather than to me. Why I offered such an outrageous sum for a woman I had never met. I considered denying it, offering some polite deflection that would preserve the comfortable fiction of our arrangement. But something in his manner invited honesty, demanded it even, and I found myself speaking truth I had not intended to share. "I am wondering many things," I said. "Why you chose me, yes, but also why you chose at all. You are wealthy beyond measure and titled beyond reproach. You could have any woman in England. Why bind yourself to a stranger with a tarnished reputation and no dowry to speak of?" He turned from the window to face me, and I saw again that flicker of something beneath the ice of his expression. It was gone before I could name it, replaced by the careful blankness I was beginning to recognize as his natural state. "I have my reasons," he said. "They are not romantic ones, I should warn you. I am not a man given to sentiment or passion. I will provide for you generously, treat you with respect, and ask very little in return. But you should not expect love. I am not capable of it, not anymore." The words should have stung. Perhaps they were meant to. But I found myself nodding in understanding, rather than recoiling in hurt. I had not expected love. I had stopped expecting it years ago, when Geoffrey Alcott disappeared with my dearest friend and left my heart in ruins. Love was a luxury for other women, women without scandals in their past and debts in their present. "I accept your terms," I said. "I ask only for honesty between us. Whatever your reasons, I would rather know them than spend our marriage wondering. something shifted in his expression, subtle as a shadow passing across the sun, a flicker of what might have been respect, or perhaps simply surprise that I had asked for something so simple. "In time," he said, "when I am ready. For now, I can tell you only that I made a promise many years ago, and this marriage is part of keeping it. You are not a replacement for anyone. You are not a means to an end. But neither are you a love match, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise." It was more than I had expected, this strange half-confession. It was more than most husbands offered their wives, I suspected, this acknowledgement that there were depths he was not yet willing to reveal. I found myself grateful for his honesty, even as I wondered what promise could possibly require such an extravagant gesture. "May I ask one thing more?" I ventured. He inclined his head in permission. "Your wife," I said carefully, watching his face for any sign of pain. "Lady Arabella, will her memory be an obstacle between us?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment I thought he would refuse to answer. But then he spoke, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "Arabella is dead," he said. "I have mourned her. I will not pretend that she never existed, but I will not compare you to her either. You are two entirely different women, and I will treat you as such." It was perhaps the kindest thing he could have said. I had spent years being compared to Cecily, the friend who had stolen my fiancé, found wanting in every comparison. To know that I would not be measured against a dead woman's memory was a relief I had not known I needed. "Thank you," I said, "for telling me that much." He nodded once, sharp and decisive, and the vulnerable moment passed. "We will marry on Saturday," he said, his voice returning to its usual formal tone. "And then we will travel to Thornwood Hall. I hope you are prepared for a very different life, Miss Whitmore. The countryside is quiet, and I am not given to entertaining." I managed a small smile, feeling some of the tension between us ease. "I have had quite enough of society, Your Grace. Quiet sounds like a blessing." For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw the ghost of an answering smile on his lips, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it, and then he was bowing over my hand and taking his leave, and I was alone again in the gray afternoon with nothing but questions for company. The wedding was a small affair, conducted in the ancient chapel of St. Margaret's, with only a handful of witnesses present. The pews that could have held hundreds contained perhaps 20 souls, mostly my father's remaining acquaintances and a few of the Duke's London associates. No family sat on his side of the aisle. His parents were long dead, and if he had other relatives, they had not been invited. My father stood beside me at the entrance, resplendent in a new suit purchased on credit against the coming fortune, his eyes bright with tears that I could not quite believe were for me. Perhaps they were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the particular joy that comes from being rescued at the last possible moment from ruin. I did not ask, and he did not explain. The Duke stood at the altar in severe black, his expression as unreadable as ever, his vows spoken in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever. He was handsome in the candlelight, I noticed with something like surprise. I had been so focused on the strangeness of our arrangement that I had not truly looked at him before. Now, walking toward him down the aisle, I saw the breadth of his shoulders, the grace of his stance, the way his dark eyes tracked my progress with unwavering attention. I wore the gown of ivory silk that the dressmakers had created in a fever of activity, all seed pearls and delicate lace, more beautiful than anything I had ever owned. A veil of antique Brussels lace, borrowed from the Duke's collection, floated behind me like mist. As I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, I caught my reflection in the polished surface of a silver candelabra, and did not recognize the woman who looked back at me. She seemed like a stranger, this bride in her finery, this woman about to become a duchess. The ceremony was brief. The vicar's words washed over me like water. Familiar phrases about love and honor and forsaking all others that seemed to have nothing to do with the arrangement we had made. I repeated my vows in a steady voice, my hand barely trembling as the Duke slid a ring onto my finger. It was a heavy band of gold, set with a single blood-red ruby, an heirloom that had belonged to Ravencourt brides for centuries. It felt strange on my hand, too significant for a union built on commerce rather than affection. When we were pronounced man and wife, the Duke kissed my cheek with the detached courtesy of an acquaintance at a garden party. His lips were warm against my skin, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne, something woody and expensive that I could not identify. Then he stepped back, offering me his arm with formal precision, and we walked together down the aisle as husband and wife. And that was that. I was no longer Rosalind Whitmore, disgraced spinster and burden to my father. I was Rosalind Ravencourt, Duchess of Ashford, mistress of Thornwood Hall, and wife to one of the most powerful men in England. The transformation should have felt more significant. It should have felt like something. Instead, I felt only the weight of the unfamiliar ring on my finger and the vast uncertainty of the future stretching out before me. The wedding breakfast was held at the Duke's London townhouse, a magnificent Georgian structure in Mayfair that I had never before set foot inside. The facade was elegant and restrained, cream-colored stone with perfectly proportioned windows, but the interior revealed the true extent of Ravencourt wealth. The rooms were grand and beautifully appointed, decorated in shades of cream and gold that spoke of old money and impeccable taste. Portraits of Ravencourt ancestors lined the walls of the dining room, their stern faces seeming to watch and judge as I picked at food I could not taste. I recognized the Duke's features in many of them. The same dark hair, the same strong jaw, the same uncompromising eyes that seemed to see through pretense to the truth beneath. My father cornered me in a quiet moment between courses, his face flushed with champagne and triumph. "You have done well," he whispered, squeezing my hands with painful enthusiasm, "better than I ever dreamed. A duchess. My daughter, a duchess. Your mother would be so proud." I doubted that very much. My mother had been a romantic, a dreamer who believed in love matches and fairy tales. She would have wept to see me married to a stranger for money, no matter how grand his title or how generous his settlement. But I smiled and nodded and allowed my father his moment of glory, because what else was there to do? By evening, my father had departed for Hampshire with the first installment of his promised fortune, and I stood alone in the entrance hall of my new husband's London home, surrounded by servants I did not know and possessions that were not yet mine. "We leave for Thornwood at dawn," the Duke said, appearing silently at my elbow. "I would recommend a good night's sleep. The journey is long." His voice was neither warm nor cold, simply matter-of-fact, the tone of a man accustomed to making arrangements and having them followed. I nodded my understanding, and he escorted me to my chambers with the same formal courtesy he had shown all day. At the door, he bowed over my hand once more. "Good night, Duchess," he said. "I will see you in the morning." And then he was gone, disappearing down the corridor toward his own apartments, and I was alone with the reality of what I had done. The journey to Thornwood Hall took 3 days by carriage, traveling north through the rolling countryside of England, as autumn painted the leaves in shades of amber and rust. The Duke and I traveled together, as propriety demanded, but we spoke little during those long hours on the road. He read correspondence and reviewed estate documents while I gazed out the window at the passing landscape, watching the gentle hills give way to wilder country as we moved ever northward. I found myself studying him when he was not aware, cataloging the details of this man who was now my husband, the way his brow furrowed when he encountered something troubling in his correspondence, the precision with which he turned the pages of his documents, the slight tension in his jaw that never quite relaxed, as if he were perpetually braced for some blow that never came. He was not unkind, I noted. When we stopped at coaching inns, he ensured I had the best room available and the warmest fire. He asked after my comfort with genuine concern, if not particular warmth. He offered me his arm when the ground was uneven and held open doors without being asked. These were the courtesies of a gentleman, nothing more, but they were offered consistently, without expectation of gratitude. On the first night, at an inn called the Red Lion, I dined alone in my room while he took his meal downstairs. The solitude was both relief and burden. I unpacked my night things and sat before the small fire, watching the flames dance and trying to imagine what my life would be like at Thornwood Hall. Would every day feel like this, I wondered? This strange mixture of security and isolation, of having everything and nothing at once? I thought of my mother, as I often did in quiet moments. She had been married for love, a match that raised eyebrows in society but brought her great happiness. I remembered the way my father had looked at her, in those early years before debts and disappointments had soured his disposition. There had been genuine affection between them, a warmth that filled our modest home and made it feel like a castle. What would she think of me now, I wondered? Would she be proud that I had secured such a grand match? Or would she weep to know that I had married without love, without even the hope of it? I suspected the latter, but I also believed she would understand. My mother had been a practical woman beneath her romantic exterior. She would have recognized necessity when she saw it. A knock at the door startled me from my reverie. When I opened it, I found a maid bearing a tray with a pot of chocolate and a small plate of biscuits. "His Grace thought you might like something warm before bed," she said, curtsying. "He asked specifically that we prepare chocolate rather than tea." The gesture surprised me. I had not mentioned to anyone that I preferred chocolate in the evening, but perhaps he had asked the servants at my father's house. Or perhaps it was simply a fortunate guess. Either way, the thoughtfulness of it touched something in my chest that I had not expected to feel. "Please thank His Grace for me," I said, taking the tray. The maid curtsied again and withdrew, leaving me alone with my chocolate and my confusion. It was a small thing, such a small thing, but it suggested that my husband was perhaps paying more attention than I had realized. The terrain changed gradually as we traveled. The neat hedgerows and cultivated fields of the south gave way to rougher pastures and scattered woodlands. By the second day, we had entered a landscape that seemed almost wild, with ancient forests and untamed hills rising on either side of the road. On the second day, as we stopped at a coaching inn to change horses, he surprised me with a question. "Do you read?" he asked, nodding toward the book I had tucked into my traveling case. I hesitated, uncertain how to answer. Many men of his station considered female education an unnecessary indulgence, even a liability. A clever wife could be dangerous, the thinking went. Too inclined to question and too difficult to control. But I had promised myself that I would be honest with him, as he had been honest with me. "I do," I said. "Poetry, mostly, and novels when I can find them. My mother taught me to love books before she died." He nodded, his expression unchanged, but I thought I detected a hint of approval in his eyes. "Thornwood has an extensive library," he said. "You may consider it at your disposal." It was a small kindness, so small that another woman might not have noticed it at all. But I had spent years being overlooked and dismissed, and I had learned to treasure whatever crumbs of consideration came my way. I thanked him with genuine warmth, and something in his rigid posture seemed to soften slightly, though I could not be sure. We arrived at Thornwood Hall on the evening of the third day, just as the sun was setting behind the distant hills. The estate emerged from the gathering dusk like something from a Gothic novel, all towers and turrets and ancient stone that seemed to drink in the fading light. It was vast, far larger than I had imagined, a sprawling edifice that must have contained hundreds of rooms. The architecture was medieval at its core, with additions from every subsequent century, creating a patchwork of styles that somehow cohered into something magnificent and slightly terrifying. The grounds stretched endlessly in every direction, formal gardens giving way to wild parkland, ancient forests standing sentinel at the edges of the manicured lawns. I glimpsed a lake in the distance, its surface catching the last rays of sunlight and transforming them into scattered gold. Somewhere nearby, a peacock called out, its strange cry echoing through the twilight air. It was beautiful and terrible and utterly overwhelming. "Welcome to Thornwood," the Duke said, watching my face with an expression I could not read. "I hope you will come to think of it as home." The carriage swept up the long drive and deposited us before the main entrance, where a line of servants stood waiting to greet their new mistress. I counted at least 30 faces as I descended from the carriage, 30 pairs of eyes assessing me with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. They curtsied and bowed as I passed, murmuring welcomes that I acknowledged with nods and smiles that felt increasingly forced. At the head of the line stood a woman of perhaps 50 years, tall and iron-spined, with gray hair pulled back severely from a face that might once have been beautiful. She wore the black dress of a housekeeper, but her bearing suggested something more, some authority that transcended mere household management. "This is Mrs. Prudence Hartley," the Duke said, pausing beside her. "She has managed Thornwood since before I was born. If you require anything, she is the one to ask." Mrs. Hartley curtsied, her sharp eyes never leaving my face. "Welcome to Thornwood Hall, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was cool and formal, giving nothing away. "We have prepared the Duchess's chambers as instructed. If you will follow me, I will show you to your rooms." I glanced at the Duke, uncertain of the protocol. He was already turning away, heading toward a different entrance with the long strides of a man eager to be elsewhere. "I will see you at dinner," he said over his shoulder. 8 o'clock. Do not feel obligated to dress formally. We keep country hours here." And then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows of his ancient home, leaving me alone with the servants and the vast, echoing silence of Thornwood Hall. Mrs. Hartley led me through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, past tapestries and portraits and suits of armor that stood guard in darkened alcoves. The house was magnificent but cold, both in temperature and in atmosphere. I saw no flowers, no personal touches, none of the warmth that transforms a building into a home. It was as if the entire estate had been frozen in time, preserved like a butterfly under glass, beautiful but lifeless. My chambers were in the east wing, a suite of rooms that had clearly been prepared with care and expense. The bedroom was vast, dominated by a canopied bed draped in velvet the color of midnight. A fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting dancing shadows across walls hung with silk, the shade of pale roses. Through an archway, I glimpsed a private sitting room with comfortable chairs and a writing desk positioned near tall windows that overlooked the gardens. It was luxurious beyond anything I had ever known. It was also utterly impersonal, as if the rooms had been decorated for some abstract idea of a duchess rather than for me. "I hope the accommodations are satisfactory, Your Grace," Mrs. Hartley said, her voice still carrying that edge of cool formality. "They are lovely," I replied. "Thank you for all your work in preparing them." Something flickered in her expression, surprise perhaps at being thanked. "The previous Duchess preferred the West Wing," she said after a moment's hesitation. "But His Grace thought you might enjoy the morning light." I filed that information away. Another piece of the puzzle I was slowly assembling. The previous Duchess, Lady Arabella Kingsley Ravencourt, the beauty who had captured the Duke's heart and then died before her time. Her ghost seemed to linger in every corner of this house, in every careful word the servant spoke, in the shadows that haunted my husband's eyes. I did not ask about her. Not yet. Some questions need time to ripen before they can be answered. "Your lady's maid will be here shortly to help you dress for dinner, Mrs." Hartley continued. "Her name is Nell. She came with recommendations from Lady Drummond's household." I thanked her again, and she curtsied and withdrew, leaving me alone in my beautiful, empty rooms. I stood by the window and watched the last light fade from the sky, watched the stars emerge one by one like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out, its mournful cry echoing across the empty parkland. I was a duchess now. I had a title and a fortune and a husband who slept in a different wing of the house. I had traded my old life for this new one, and there was no going back. I pressed my palm against the cold glass of the window and wondered if I would ever feel at home. Dinner that first evening was a strange and silent affair. We sat at opposite ends of a table designed to seat 30, the space between us vast as an ocean, our voices swallowed by the cavernous dining room. The Duke ate methodically, without pleasure, answering my attempts at conversation with monosyllables and long pauses. I gave up eventually and focused on the food, which was excellent, and the wine, which was better. The candlelight flickered across the polished mahogany, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward us like grasping fingers. The portraits on the walls watched our awkward meal with painted disapproval, generation after generation of Ravencourts bearing witness to this strangest of marriages. Afterward, I retreated to my chambers and he disappeared into his study, and we did not see each other again until the following morning at breakfast. Thus began the pattern of my married life. We took meals together, but rarely spoke. We passed each other in corridors and nodded politely like strangers at a hotel. He spent his days managing the estate, and his evenings locked in his study with correspondence and account books. I spent my days exploring the house and grounds, acquainting myself with the servants, trying to find my footing in this strange new world. The library became my sanctuary. It was everything the Duke had promised and more, a vast 2-story room lined floor to ceiling with books of every description. Poetry and philosophy, history and science, novels in English and French and Italian, and languages I could not even identify. A rolling ladder allowed access to the highest shelves, and comfortable leather chairs were positioned near tall windows that offered views of the gardens below. I spent hours there each day, curled in a leather chair by the fire, losing myself in worlds far removed from my own. The books became my companions in those lonely weeks, their characters more real to me than the silent servants and absent husband who shared my new home. Sometimes I would look up from my reading and find the Duke watching me from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He never came in when I was there. He simply observed for a moment, his dark eyes tracking my movements with an intensity that made my skin prickle, and then he moved on, a ghost haunting his own home. I began to leave books for him in return, volumes I thought he might enjoy, placed casually on tables where he was sure to find them, a collection of essays on agricultural improvements which I had noticed him discussing with his steward, a volume of philosophy that touched on questions of duty and honor, a novel that I thought might make him smile if he ever allowed himself such an indulgence. He never mentioned these offerings either, but the books always disappeared from where I had placed them, and sometimes I would find them later on his desk in the study, well thumbed and marked with strips of paper. It was a conversation conducted in silence, a courtship of ideas, if not of hearts. I began to know the rhythms of the house, the quiet hours of early morning when the servants moved like ghosts through the corridors, the bustle of midday when the estate's business was conducted, the stillness of evening when the great house seemed to hold its breath. I learned which floorboards creaked and which doors stuck, which windows caught the best light, and which rooms were too cold to enter until the fires had been lit. The housekeeper, Mrs. Hartley, thawed toward me gradually, her initial coolness giving way to something approaching warmth. She began to seek my opinions on household matters, to consult me about menus and cleaning schedules and the 1,000 small decisions that kept a great house running. I suspect she was testing me, seeing if I was worthy of the title I now bore, and I applied myself to the task with determination born of having nothing else to do. One afternoon, about a month after my arrival, she invited me to take tea with her in her private sitting room, an unprecedented honor that spoke to some shift in her estimation of me. Her rooms were comfortable and warm, decorated with personal treasures that revealed a life I had not suspected. A collection of porcelain figurines, a needlepoint sampler that proclaimed, "God bless this house," a small portrait of a handsome man in the uniform of a naval officer. "My brother," she said, following my gaze. "He died at Trafalgar, serving under Nelson himself." "I am sorry," I said, meaning it. She nodded, accepting my sympathy with the grace of one who had long since made peace with loss. "He died doing what he loved," she said. "There are worse fates." She poured tea with practiced efficiency, her movements precise and economical. "I have served this family for 32 years, she said. "I came as a young maid when the late Duke and Duchess were newly married. I watched their son grow from a boy to a man. I was here when they died, and I was here when Lady Arabella died, and I have watched His Grace close himself off from the world, piece by piece." She fixed me with a look that was both challenging and hopeful. "You are the first person in 3 years who has made him remember that he is still alive," she said. "I do not know what passed between you, and I do not ask. But I have seen the way he watches you, and I have seen the books he leaves for you, and I have seen something in his eyes that I thought was gone forever." I did not know what to say. I had not realized that others had noticed the small exchange of kindnesses between us, had not understood that our silent conversation was visible to those who knew where to look. "I do not ask you to love him," Mrs. Hartley continued. "That would be presumptuous. But I ask you to be patient with him. He has built walls around his heart because he fears what lies on the other side. If you can help him find his way back to himself, you will have done something that all the money in England could not accomplish." "I will try," I said, and I meant it more than I had meant anything in a very long time. Weeks passed. The leaves fell from the trees, and the nights grew longer and colder. I learned the names of the servants and the layout of the house, discovered hidden gardens and forgotten rooms, found paths through the grounds that seemed designed for solitary contemplation. I took long walks through the estate, bundling myself in wool and fur against the bitter wind, watching my breath form clouds in the frigid air. I wrote letters to my father, carefully cheerful missives that omitted more than they revealed. I did not tell him about the silence that filled Thornwood like water filling a well. I did not describe the loneliness that wrapped around me like a second skin. I wrote of beautiful rooms and excellent food, and a husband who was attentive and kind, because the alternative was to admit that I had traded one form of misery for another. I tried to be the Duchess Thornwood required, dignified and capable and utterly alone. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. It started with small things, gestures so subtle that I might have missed them if I had not been paying attention. A book left on the table in my sitting room, a collection of sonnets with a ribbon marking a particular page. When I opened to the marked selection, I found a poem about hope, about light returning after long darkness. There was no note, no indication of who had left it, but I knew. The next week, a vase of late-blooming roses appeared on my breakfast tray, their fragrance filling my chamber with summer sweetness, despite the autumn chill outside. Then a fire began appearing in the library before I arrived each morning. The chair I preferred already drawn close to the warmth, a wool blanket folded neatly on its arm. The Duke never mentioned these gestures, never acknowledged them when I tried to thank him. But they continued, day after day, small kindnesses that spoke louder than words. A new book would appear on my table, its subject something we had briefly discussed at dinner. A pot of my favorite tea would be waiting in the sitting room when I returned from my walks. The path I preferred through the gardens would be cleared of fallen leaves, the fountain I liked to visit somehow made to flow despite the cold. He was courting me, I realized with something like wonder. Not with grand gestures or passionate declarations, but with the quiet attention of a man who was watching, learning, trying to understand. Then came the evening when the silence finally broke. I had gone to the library after dinner, as was my habit, seeking the comfort of my current novel. But someone was already there, standing before the fire with a glass of brandy in hand. The Duke turned as I entered, and for the first time since our wedding, he did not retreat. "Forgive me," I said, hovering in the doorway. "I did not mean to intrude." He shook his head, a small motion that somehow communicated both permission and invitation. "You are not intruding. This is your home as much as mine. Please, come in." I crossed the room slowly, uncertain of this new dynamic. The fire cast dancing shadows across his face, softening the hard lines, making him seem younger and more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. He gestured toward the chair opposite his own, and I sat, my heart beating faster than the simple situation warranted. "I was reading your sonnets," I said, breaking the silence that threatened to swallow us both. "The ones you left for me. They are beautiful." His expression flickered, something moving beneath the surface like a fish glimpsed in deep water. "They were my mother's favorites," he said at last. "She used to read them aloud on winter evenings when I was young. She would sit by this very fire and read for hours, and I would fall asleep listening to the rhythm of her voice." It was more than he had ever told me about himself, this tiny glimpse into his past. I treasured it like a pearl, this offering of memory. "Tell me about her," I said softly. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if searching for answers there. "She was everything good in this house," he said at last. "Kind and warm and full of laughter. My father adored her. When she died, he was never the same. The light went out of him, as if she had taken it with her when she left." I waited, sensing there was more. "He followed her within the year," the Duke continued, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper. "The doctors said it was his heart, but I knew the truth. He simply could not bear to live without her. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything at all. And one morning, he simply did not wake up. I understood then, or began to understand, the weight that this man carried. He had lost his parents to love itself, had watched his father wither away from grief like a plant deprived of sunlight. No wonder he had armored himself against feeling. No wonder he had warned me not to expect sentiment. Love, for him, was not a gift, but a curse, something that destroyed rather than sustained. And Lady Arabella, I said carefully, was it the same for you? He turned to face me then, and I saw the pain written plainly across his features, no longer hidden behind the mask of indifference. His eyes, those dark, impenetrable eyes, were suddenly full of something raw and human. "No," he said, "that is what haunts me. I cared for her, but I never loved her as she deserved. She was beautiful and accomplished, and everything a duchess should be, and I married her because it was expected, because my mother had approved of the match before she died. But I never gave Arabella my heart, because I did not know how. She died thinking herself unloved, and I can never make that right." The confession hung between us, raw and honest and terrible in its simplicity. I did not know what to say, did not know how to comfort a man who bore such guilt. So I simply sat with him, sharing the silence, letting him know that he was not alone. After a long while, he spoke again. "I married you because of a promise I made to my mother before she died. She begged me to find a wife who was strong and kind, who could bring light back to Thornwood. She said I would know her when I saw her, that something would tell me when I had found the right person." He set down his brandy glass and met my eyes with startling directness. "I saw you that night at the ball," he said. "I saw your father's cruelty, and I saw the way you bore it, with dignity and grace and a strength that took my breath away. You did not crumble. You did not flee. You stood there and faced the judgment of 500 people, and you held your head high. And I knew that you were the one my mother had spoken of, that you were meant to be here, in this house, as my partner." I could not speak. My throat was tight with emotions I could not name, my heart pounding against my ribs like a wild thing seeking escape. "I do not ask for love," he continued, his voice rough. "I do not deserve it. But I hope, in time, that we might be friends, real friends, not strangers sharing a roof. I am tired of being alone, Rosalind. I am tired of this endless winter." It was the first time he had used my given name. I rose from my chair and crossed the space between us, standing before him in the firelight. He looked up at me with something like hope in his eyes, uncertain and fragile, and I felt my own walls begin to crumble. "I would like that," I said. "I would like that very much." He reached out and took my hand, his grip warm and firm and unexpectedly gentle. We stood there for a long moment, not speaking, simply holding on to each other in the dancing shadows. Two lonely souls taking the first tentative steps toward connection. That night marked a turning point in our strange marriage. We began to spend our evenings together, reading by the fire or simply talking about nothing and everything. I learned that he had a dry wit hidden beneath his severe exterior, that he loved music, though he rarely played anymore, that he had once dreamed of traveling the world before duty had anchored him to Thornwood. I learned that he remembered every kindness and never forgot a slight, that he was fiercely protective of those in his care, that beneath the ice there burned a fire that had simply been banked too long. He learned things about me, too. He learned about my childhood, about my mother's gentle influence and my father's gradual decline. He learned about Geoffrey Alcott and the betrayal that had shaped my understanding of love. He listened without judgment, offered comfort without platitudes, and slowly became someone I could trust. The servants noticed the change. Mrs. Hartley's cool formality thawed into something approaching warmth. The footmen smiled when they saw us together. The kitchen sent up my favorite dishes and his, side by side on the dinner table, like offerings to the gods of reconciliation. The whole house seemed to breathe more easily, as if Thornwood itself had been waiting for this thaw. Winter arrived in full force, blanketing Thornwood in white and trapping us together in the great house. The snow fell for days without stopping, transforming the world outside into a landscape from a fairy tale. We walked the corridors side by side, exploring rooms that had been closed for years. We sat together in the music room while he played the pianoforte, his long fingers coaxing melancholy melodies from the keys. We talked late into the night, long after the fires had burned low, neither of us wanting to be the first to retire. I began to feel something I had thought lost forever. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. A warmth that had nothing to do with fireplaces, a lightness that seemed to lift the shadows from the ancient stone walls. When he smiled at something I said, truly smiled, his whole face transformed in a way that made my heart skip. Then one evening, everything changed again. We were in the library, as had become our habit, when the Duke rose abruptly and crossed to a cabinet I had never seen him open. He withdrew a small portrait, no larger than his palm, and stood gazing at it for a long moment before turning to face me. "There is something you should know," he said, "something I should have told you before we married." I waited, my heart suddenly pounding. He crossed the room and placed the portrait in my hands. It showed a woman of striking beauty, with dark hair and clear gray eyes, and a smile that seemed to radiate warmth even from the painted canvas. Her features were refined but kind, her expression one of gentle amusement, as if she had just heard a joke and was waiting to share the laughter. "My mother," he said, "Lady Helena Ravencourt. She was born Lady Helena Whitmore, second daughter of the Earl of Westbrook, your great-grandfather's brother." I stared at the portrait, uncomprehending. The realization came slowly, pieces falling into place like the tumblers of a lock. "We are family," I said, "distant cousins." He nodded. "When my mother learned of your father's difficulties, before her death, she asked me to help if ever the opportunity arose. She had always regretted losing touch with the English branch of her family. She hoped that by bringing you here, she could right an old wrong, could reunite the family that had drifted apart over generations." I thought of the society gossip, the whispers about why the Duke had chosen me. They had assumed it was pity or perversion, some twisted motive that only the wealthy could afford. They had never imagined something so simple as family loyalty, as a son keeping his dying mother's last wish. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" I asked. He sat down beside me, closer than he had ever sat before. I felt the warmth of him, the solid presence that had become so familiar over these past months. "I did not want you to feel obligated," he said. "I did not want gratitude to color everything between us. I wanted you to come to know me, truly know me, before you learned the connection. I wanted whatever grew between us to be real, not born of duty or indebtedness." I looked again at the portrait, at the familiar gray eyes that mirrored my own, my father's eyes and his father's before him, passing down through generations until they found their way to me. "She would have been my cousin," I said softly. "Once removed. She would have been your family," the Duke corrected. "As I am now, as I hope to remain." I set down the portrait and turned to face him fully. The firelight played across his features, illuminating the vulnerability he had hidden for so long. I saw the lonely young man who had lost his parents, the grieving widower who blamed himself for his wife's unhappiness, the proud Duke who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from further pain. And I saw something else, something new, something that made my breath catch and my heart race and my entire body feel suddenly, achingly alive. I saw the man who had rescued me from humiliation without expectation of reward, the man who had left books and roses and small kindnesses in my path, the man who had opened his heart to me, one painful confession at a time, trusting me with secrets he had kept locked away for years. I saw my husband, and for the first time, I truly saw him. "Thaddeus," I said, testing his name on my lips. He looked at me with something like wonder, as if hearing his name spoken by me was a gift beyond measure. "I know you did not marry me for love," I continued. "I know that was never part of our arrangement, but I find myself, against all expectation, beginning to care for you, very much." His breath caught. His eyes, those dark, fathomless eyes, seemed to glisten in the firelight. "I should warn you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Once I allow myself to love, I love completely, dangerously. I have avoided it for so long because I feared what I might become. I feared becoming my father, losing myself so completely in another person that I could not survive their loss." I reached out and touched his face, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips, the slight roughness of his jaw, the way he leaned almost imperceptibly into my touch. "I am not afraid," I said. "I have been cold for so long, I am ready to burn." He kissed me then, there in the library where we had found each other, where two lonely souls had finally learned to hope. It was not the kiss of a stranger or an arrangement. It was the kiss of a man who had found something precious after years of searching, the kiss of someone coming home. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and I melted into him as if we had been made to fit together. When we broke apart at last, foreheads pressed together, hearts pounding in unison, I felt tears on my cheeks. I was not certain if they were mine or his. "Stay with me tonight," he whispered. "Not in the East Wing, not in separate chambers. Here, with me." I answered with another kiss, and no more words were needed. Spring came to Thornwood like a resurrection, melting the winter snows and painting the grounds in shades of green and gold. I woke each morning in my husband's arms, watching the dawn light filter through the curtains of the master bedroom, marveling at the change that had overtaken our lives. Love, it turned out, suited us both. Thaddeus smiled now, actually smiled, his face transforming with a warmth that startled everyone who had known him before. He laughed at breakfast and held my hand at dinner and kissed me in corridors where servants might see. He was shameless in his affection, as if making up for years of enforced coldness, and I basked in it like a flower turning toward the sun. We redecorated the house together, banishing the shadows and replacing them with color and light. We opened windows that had been shuttered for years, letting in the fresh spring air. We invited neighbors who had been ignored, filled the halls with music and laughter that echoed off the ancient stones. Mrs. Hartley wept openly when she saw the transformation, tears of joy running down cheeks that had been stern for so long. "We are happy here again," she told me one evening, "as we were when the late Duchess Helena was alive. You have brought her spirit back to Thornwood, Your Grace." In June, we received word that my father had died peacefully in his sleep. His debts were paid, his reputation restored, his final years spent in comfort rather than disgrace. I grieved for him, truly grieved, for all the years we had wasted in resentment and disappointment, for the father he had once been, and the father I had wished he could become. Thaddeus held me through the long nights of mourning, offering comfort without words, understanding that some losses require silence rather than speech. When I emerged from the darkness of grief, he was there waiting, patient and steadfast, his love a constant flame that never flickered. That autumn, on the anniversary of our first meeting, we hosted a ball at Thornwood Hall. The great house shone with 1,000 candles, the ballroom filled with flowers and music and the cream of society. Ladies who had whispered about me behind their fans now curtsied and called me Your Grace with genuine respect. Gentlemen who had laughed at my father's auction now sought my husband's favor with desperate eagerness. The transformation of Thornwood for the occasion had taken weeks of preparation. Mrs. Hartley had marshaled an army of servants to clean and polish every surface until the old house gleamed like new. Flowers had been brought from London and arranged in every room, their fragrance mingling with the scent of beeswax candles and French perfume. The orchestra had been hired from the finest agency in the city, and the menu had been planned with exquisite care, each dish designed to showcase the bounty of the estate. I had overseen much of the preparation myself, throwing myself into the work with an energy that surprised even me. This ball was more than a social obligation. It was a declaration. It was Thornwood announcing to the world that the long winter was over, that the Duke had emerged from his mourning, that the ancient house was alive once more. My gown for the evening was a masterpiece of the dressmaker's art, deep sapphire silk that caught the light like water, embroidered with silver thread that traced patterns of stars and moons across the bodice. Thaddeus had presented me with the Ravencourt sapphires to wear with it, a parure that had belonged to his mother and her mother before her, a necklace of stones like frozen midnight, earrings that swayed with every movement, a tiara that sat upon my carefully arranged hair like a crown. "You look like a queen," he had said when I descended the stairs to meet him, his voice rough with emotion. "No, better than a queen. You look like yourself, and that is more beautiful than any crown could make you." His words had warmed me more than the finest jewels ever could. Now I stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching the guests swirl below, remembering the woman I had been just 1 year before. She seemed like a stranger now, that frightened girl in her faded blue gown, standing alone by the window while her father sold her like livestock. A hand slipped into mine, warm and familiar. "What are you thinking?" Thaddeus asked, standing beside me in his evening clothes, impossibly handsome, entirely mine. "I am thinking about how far we have come," I said, "about how much has changed, about how grateful I am that you saw something in me that night, something no one else could see." He raised my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles, there before all the assembled guests, a declaration more powerful than any words. "You saved me," he said quietly. "I was drowning in guilt and grief, and you pulled me back to shore. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." I turned to face him, this man who had become my whole world, this husband who had started as a stranger and become my dearest friend, my partner, my love. "You already are," I said. "You always were." The orchestra struck up a waltz, the opening notes floating up to where we stood. "Dance with me," he said, his eyes bright with mischief and adoration. I laughed, a sound of pure joy. "You hate dancing. I hate dancing alone," he corrected. "With you, I suspect I might enjoy it very much." We descended the staircase together, hand in hand, and stepped onto the dance floor as the crowd parted to make way. He took me in his arms, and we began to move, spinning through the candlelight while 500 pairs of eyes watched in amazement. "The cold duke dances," someone whispered. "The disgraced spinster glows," someone else replied. "Let them whisper," I thought, as Thaddeus pulled me closer. Let them say whatever they wished. I had been sold for £100 and purchased for £1 million, and I had found something that no amount of money could ever buy. I had found love. Real love, the kind that grows slowly like an oak tree, putting down roots so deep that no storm can shake them. The kind that survives winter and blooms in spring, that transforms strangers into soulmates and houses into homes. Father offered £100 for my hand, and a duke interrupted with £1 million. But what I gained that night in the Ashworth ballroom was worth more than all the fortunes in England. I gained a partner, a protector, a friend. I gained a life. I gained myself. And as we danced on through the evening, Thaddeus's arms around me and the future stretching out before us like a golden road, I knew that this was only the beginning. 3 years passed, each one sweeter than the last. Thornwood Hall became famous throughout the county for its warmth and hospitality, its Duchess and Duke, who were so clearly, scandalously, unfashionably in love. We traveled together to Paris and Rome and Vienna, seeing the world that Thaddeus had once dreamed of exploring. We filled our home with art and books and music, with friends and laughter, and the comfortable intimacy of 2 souls perfectly matched. I learned to ride, properly ride, thundering across the moors with my husband at my side. I learned to manage a household, to balance ledgers and direct servants and oversee the endless details of estate life. I learned to be a duchess, not in name but in truth, commanding respect through competence and kindness rather than mere title. And Thaddeus learned to live again. The darkness that had haunted him when we first met faded year by year until it was nothing but a distant memory. He laughed easily now, freely, without the shadow of guilt that had once poisoned every joy. He spoke of his parents with love rather than grief, of Arabella with compassion rather than shame. He had made peace with his past because he had finally found a future worth living. On the evening of our 3rd anniversary, we walked together through the gardens of Thornwood, the summer sun painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The roses were in full bloom, filling the air with their heady perfume, and the bees hummed lazily among the blossoms. "Do you remember," I asked, "the night you first came to the library? When you told me about your mother's promise?" He smiled, that slow, warm smile that still made my heart race after all these years. "I remember everything about that night," he said. "I remember the way the firelight caught your hair. I remember thinking that I had never seen anyone so brave." I laughed softly. I was terrified. I thought you might change your mind, send me back to London in disgrace. Never. He stopped walking and turned to face me, taking both my hands in his. "From the moment I saw you, I knew. My mother was right. You were the one." I leaned up to kiss him, there among the roses, with the summer evening wrapping around us like a blessing. "I have something to tell you," I said when we parted, "something wonderful." His brow furrowed slightly, curiosity mixed with concern. "What is it?" I placed his hand gently over my heart, where another heart had begun to beat. "We are going to be a family," I said. The look on his face was something I would treasure forever. Shock gave way to wonder, wonder to joy, joy to a radiance so intense it seemed to rival the setting sun. He swept me into his arms and spun me around, laughing like the young man he had never been allowed to be. When he set me down, there were tears on his cheeks, but they were tears of happiness, the kind that speak louder than any words. "I love you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rosalind, I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my life. You have given me everything. a home, a heart, and now a family. I cupped his face in my hands, brushing away the tears with my thumbs. "You gave me everything too," I said. "A purpose, a place, a love I never dared to hope for. We saved each other, Thaddeus. That is the miracle." We stood there as the sun slipped below the horizon, as the first stars emerged in the deepening sky, as the night wrapped around us in a velvet embrace. We stood there, husband and wife, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together from the ashes of loneliness and regret. Many years later, when our hair had turned gray and our grandchildren filled the halls of Thornwood with their laughter, people would still tell the story of how we met. The auction at Ashworth Manor had become legend, a tale of scandal and redemption, of a disgraced woman and a mysterious duke and a love that had transformed them both. But those people, I always said, knew only the beginning. They knew the shock of that evening, the whispered gossip, the £1,000,000 that had changed hands. They did not know what came after. They did not know the patient courtship, the slow thawing of frozen hearts, the quiet moments of confession and understanding that had built our marriage brick by brick. They did not know that the real story was not about money at all. It was about finding the courage to love again after loss, about recognizing a kindred spirit in a stranger's eyes, about building something beautiful from broken pieces. It was about hope, that most fragile and most enduring of human gifts. On the last night of my life, many decades hence, I will lie in the room where we shared so many years together, my hand in his, our fingers intertwined as they always were. I will look at his face, aged but beloved, and I will remember that ballroom, that humiliation, that moment when a stranger's voice cut through my despair and offered me salvation. I will remember the way he looked at me that first night, seeing something in me that no one else had ever seen. I will remember our first dance, our first kiss, our first night together. I will remember our children and their children, the family we built from nothing but love and hope and stubborn determination. And I will close my eyes, knowing that I have lived a life beyond my wildest dreams, that I have loved and been loved in return, that I have been truly, completely, magnificently happy. That is the ending I wish for this story. Not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with quiet gratitude for a life well lived. Not with tragedy, but with triumph. Not alone, but together. Always, forever, together. And now, dear friend, you know my story. You know how I came to Thornwood, how I found my husband, how we built our life together from the wreckage of scandal and shame. You know that true love can grow in the most unlikely soil, that second chances are real, that even the coldest heart can learn to warm. I have lived to see our family flourish, to watch our children grow strong and kind, to know that the legacy we leave behind is one of love rather than loneliness. Thornwood Hall, which once seemed so cold and forbidding, has become a place of warmth and welcome, a home in the truest sense of the word. If there is anything I would have you take from my tale, it is this: never underestimate the power of patience and kindness. Never give up on finding connection, even when the world tells you that you are not worth loving. Never assume that you know another person's heart, for even the coldest exterior may hide depths of feeling that would astound you. The night my father offered me for sale, I thought my life was ending. I thought I had reached the lowest point that any woman could reach, stripped of dignity and hope and any expectation of happiness. I could never have imagined that moment was actually the beginning, that the stranger who stepped forward to claim me would become the greatest gift I had ever received. Love does not always arrive as we expect it. Sometimes it comes wrapped in contracts and conditions, in arrangements made for practical reasons by practical people. But that does not make it any less real when it finally blooms. The seed does not care how it came to be planted. It cares only for the soil and the sun and the water that help it grow. I was sold for £100 and purchased for £1,000,000. but the value of what I found cannot be measured in any currency. Love is the only treasure that matters, and I am at last immeasurably rich.